Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. 300 years ago, a goddess named Gaia loved humans very much. She prepared a gift for the empire called Helenir that followed her. The goddess carefully gathered all the love and light she had to create a holy soul and sent it off on the purest pairing the empire had ever had. And just like that, one day, the saint was born. But the aristocrats couldn't bear the fact that such an honor was bestowed on ordinary commoners, and that's why they ruthlessly carved out their family tree completely, and then locked this saint right here in White Castle. They completely isolated her from people and the outside world. And when the girl was 15 years old, the aristocrats discovered that her blood also had healing properties. They did this in order to satisfy all their desires, and they also started to gather this magical power for the same purpose. Amidst the colors and loneliness, blood slowly began to flow down my body. And after that, a very exciting moment happened. Here was this saint named Eva, and soon a search battalion was announced for her, for she was running away. The people who were after her called the girl names and said that she must have been cheating them all this time, and it really annoyed them. But one man carried her in his arms, and they were able to get away from the crowd for a while. He breathed a sigh of relief and said that they had been saved after all. Eve looked at him and said only his name, Avalon, and in a trembling voice asked his forgiveness for everything. The man pulled her even closer to him and told her that she hadn't really done anything wrong. It was all his fault. But Saint said she would really like to live as an ordinary girl in her next life, not with these powers. She wants to live a life where she will be someone's daughter, where she can be someone's wife and then a mother. I also apologize to you for making him do all that. The girl looked at him and said that the saint's life was too hard. So she, if she could really be an ordinary girl in her next life, would try to live it with dignity. Avalon put her hand to his cheek and said that she could still stand her up. But the girl smiled back at him with her last strength and said that she was truly grateful to him. After that, her eyes closed and she took her last breath. The man couldn't believe it was really happening. And turning to the saint, he asked her to hold on just a little longer. He said that she would make it, and he promised her that everything would be fine. His hands were trembling, but he still pulled Ava's body closer and closer to him. The man cried and said that he didn't want her to leave him. He wanted her to be near him. But when Avalon realized it was too late, he couldn't stand his emotions and started screaming, asking the goddess Jaya what the girl had done wrong. He didn't understand how even after locking her up and leaving her alone, the girl still continued to give her her blood. Her whole body in pus and blood of color never once resented her share. But she still wasn't helping the girl, and Avalon said that if she was just going to steal everything from her, she shouldn't have given her anything at all. He wished the goddess would let her live her life normally. The man wept and even began to curse the goddess, for she had taken from him such a beautiful girl, whom he loved with all his soul. Ava, for her part, opened her eyes immediately when she fell asleep. She was covered in sweat and had tears in her eyes. The girl sat down on the bed, and for a while tried to understand what had happened, looking around. She realized that she was having that horrible and incomprehensible dream again. Suddenly a maid came up to her, and addressing her as a young mistress, Ariel asked if she was awake yet, for breakfast was ready. The girl agreed, and soon, when she was already dressed in appropriate clothes, went downstairs, where the whole family gathered around a huge table to have breakfast. She sat in silence and didn't even touch her food once, while her brother, who was sitting across from her, had almost finished everything. They sat like that for a while, and then the brother turned to his father, who was sitting next to him, and said that his sister was acting very strangely, for she was not eating anything at all. The man looked at his daughter and said that it was really true. He also asked his daughter not to make that sour face of hers. But when he said that phrase, his wife, who was sitting next to him, slapped his leg to make a sign for him to shut up. Eva was silent for a while, and then she said that she had been having very strange dreams lately. When she spoke, everyone immediately paid attention to the girl, because they were really interested. She, in turn, began to remember what she sees every night, and said that she had a dream in which a silver-haired knight was crying for a reason she did not understand. And if she thought about it that way, She even had the idea that she might have been a saint in a past life. When the girl voiced this phrase aloud, she began to smile happily, for it encouraged her. There was complete silence in the room for a while. They were all pondering the words Ava had just said. But then my father suddenly started laughing loudly, and his emotions were so strong that he even beat his hand on the table and asked how she could be a saint. The brother, who was sitting next to his sister and sensed the whole tense aura, looked at his father and said that he really better stop doing that right now. The man in turn waved his hand and looked at his daughter and replied that he did go a little overboard, so he apologized to her. Mother decided to support her daughter and asked what was wrong with Ariel. Her eyes were not golden like the rest of them, but she was beautiful, like a saint, and innocent too. Father, who was trying to calm down, could no longer. He blushed all red because of this effort to hold back his laughter, and said that he couldn't do it anymore. And then he laughed very loudly, right through the whole manor. He turned to his wife and said that somehow you can't look with a saint. She can't even stand next to him. Ella got very angry and grabbed a fork, ready to hit her father right with it. Her brother tried to stop her, telling her to put the fork down because it might be too dangerous. But the girl told him to move away if he didn't want to get hit first. A serious quarrel was connected between them, and the maids, who were already absolutely accustomed to such situations, simply stood by and watched it, not wishing to interfere. Some time had passed since then, and the children, when they had finished breakfast, set off. Ariel didn't understand how he could do that to his daughter's only dream, and on such an important day. She didn't understand, and how he could take it and laugh at her, and she thinks he's already overreacting. She looked at her brother and asked, "Is the fact that she was a saint in a past life such a ridiculous fact?" The guy in turn smiled and told her not to worry. After all, he was always like this. Probably his father wasn't even aware that this particular day was Yosohe's day. Iriela suddenly started shouting and said that he was a veteran like himself because he started laughing and bickering in the first place. The guy felt a little uncomfortable and he apologized to his sister. The girl turned the other way, looking out the window, and said that they were all very bad. The boy became very serious and thought that something was obviously wrong with her. He looked at his sister, not understanding why she had dreamed such a thing on this particular day. In fact, Yasoja is arranged in memory of Saint Mary, who was the beloved goddess Gaia. A special event is held when noble ladies gather at the palace of Helipim where she lived. So the guy thought about the fact that this could be a very even bad sign. But then suddenly the whole heap turned to them and told them that they had almost arrived. When Ariel heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Did they really get here so quickly?" But when the girl looked out of the window, she saw the beautiful castle to which they were approaching. Also in front of them were many other carriages going to the same place. Soon they pulled up to the exit, and her brother held out his hand to help her out of the carriage. The girl looked around admiringly and said that this was, after all, the very palace in which the saint herself had lived. Her brother asked her to watch her step. When they looked around, the boy also said that apparently Estelle hadn't arrived yet. Ariel smiled. She was still well impressed after what she had seen and said that was right. She would wait for this girl inside. The boy, when he heard this, was immediately frightened. He said he couldn't go in there and asked his sister if she could handle it herself. The girl was indignant and asked him who he thought she was. Ariel replied with a smile on her face that she needed to look around the castle. After all, this was her only opportunity in life. But the brother said that there were a lot of people there, and he was very worried that she might get lost. The girl replied that it was all right, because all the people there were noble, so surely nothing good would happen. Ariel smiled and said that he could definitely not worry, because she was already 20 and old enough, so she would be able to take care of herself in any situation. Despite reassuring her brother, when the girl stepped inside, she was immediately lost, not realizing where she was at all. The palace was actually much larger than she thought, so Ariel decided to just look around. Ariel walked from through the various nooks and crannies of this estate and marveled at the scale of it, as well as the beautiful view it offered. She soon came upon some 2 statues as well, and when she saw them, she thought to herself that this was simply an incredibly beautiful structure. It was actually a statue of Saint Mary and the Knight of Avalon. When she took a closer look at the man's face, she thought it reminded her of someone. Ariel was so enraptured that she couldn't even look away. But she couldn't remember where she'd seen that face. Tears welled up in her eyes at the beauty of the sight. But at the same second, she felt strange. Her chest suddenly began to stab, and she didn't understand what was happening, because it had never happened before. Her tears wouldn't stop flowing, and no matter how much she wanted to calm down, they kept coming. She stared at the man, not realizing who he was, and she also didn't know why her heart suddenly ached so much when she saw only his face. The girl briefly began to speculate on the possibilities, but in that moment she felt even more painful. Ariel was twisted all the way in half. The pain was so intense that she couldn't even breathe, and she fell unconscious shortly afterward. But at that moment, a man with a sword in his hand suddenly started to approach her. He saw her, and speaking as if to the girl, said that he would never break his promise. The stranger took her in his arms and said that was why he wanted her not to go back to those nightmares anymore, because he would take care of her. He started wiping her tears and said that's why he hoped she could live a normal life like she wanted to all along. While Ariel was unconscious, an unfamiliar silhouette of a man appeared before her, and she tried to find out who he was. The girl begged him not to leave, but the stranger only asked that she rest, for all was well. He wouldn't leave her alone. Ariel was very concerned. She said she had waited so long, waiting for him. So she wanted him to stay, and she also wanted him to tell her who he really was. Yet shortly after what had happened, the girl finally began to regain consciousness. She heard a man's voice telling her to breathe slowly, or Elle didn't understand who he was and why he was talking to her. The stranger in turn said that everything was fine and asked her to try again. The girl closed and then opened her eyes again and looked at him, not realizing who he was. The man smiled and said that her eyes had finally opened and he was very glad she was awake. Ariel, when she saw the man's silhouette in its entirety, was simply in great surprise. She was silent for a while, then sighed and said that he was very handsome. When she heard her voice, she suddenly realized that she had accidentally voiced her thoughts. It made her feel very uncomfortable, not realizing why she had said it at all. The girl immediately moved away from him, because she didn't want it to be like this. They were silent for some time. After that, the stranger asked her how she was feeling and whether she could stand up. He also held out his hand to help her. Ariel let him help her up and also apologized for making him so uncomfortable when they first met. Well, the man smiled and said there was nothing wrong with that. Besides, he was very pleased that she liked his face. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was emphasizing it so much. They were silent for a while. After that, she realized that she hadn't even had time to introduce herself. So she bowed and, introducing herself, said her name was Ariel Heim. The man bowed to her in return and said his name was Ravnar. However, she could just call him Rav. The girl repeated his name aloud, not realizing what was happening to her. She assumed she was just crazy and couldn't figure out what she liked about him, because when she looked at him, she was red in the face. Rav was very serious and said that the palace is quite confusing, so this particular place is hard to get into. So he wondered how she could have ended up in such a part of the estate in the first place. For a while, Ariel contemplated what to say to him, but then decided to admit that she was lost. Then the man, smiling, said that if she was still looking for a place to hold the party, he offered to escort her so she wouldn't get lost again. They set off, and Ariel told him some facts about her family. The boy smiled and said that from what she had told him, her family was very close-knit. When the girl heard this, she was surprised enough to say that maybe, but they are always laughing at something. Her mother, father, and even her brother all treat her like a little child, but she never understood why they treated her like that, since she was old enough. She had just recently turned 20 years old. Then she turned to her new acquaintance and asked him how old he was. The man became a little uncomfortable, and turning away from her, he said that he didn't know the exact numbers. Rav was silent for a while. Then he said he was probably about 27 years old, but maybe more. Ariel was very surprised when she heard this. But then she suddenly began to smile foolishly, for she thought of the fact that they were only 7 years apart, and if she married him, she would surely be married sooner than she had expected. But then she thought about the reaction of her father, who didn't understand how she could leave him just to get married. and thought he wouldn't let her do it. But at that moment she was interrupted from her musings by the voice of her new acquaintance, who inquired what she was even thinking about. Iriel became very uncomfortable at these thoughts, and the boy said she muttered something about embarrassing her father. The girl, when she heard this, was immediately embarrassed and said that she didn't mean anything like that, but then, smiling, summarized her previous words by saying that she didn't hate them anyway, because they were her beautiful family. Rav, when he heard those words, immediately smiled and looked her straight in the face and said that she looked really happy now, and that was an incredible relief to him. Iriel couldn't believe he was really saying that, so she started hiding her embarrassment-reddened face behind her hat and asked if he really meant it. The man loved the way she was embarrassed and said that she was certainly much happier and even transformed since they had met. After a while, they were still walking to the feast when suddenly some girl who was dressed in red approached them. She turned to Iriel and was very rude. When the girl looked up at the unfamiliar voice, she immediately recognized who it belonged to, for it was Estelle. Estelle immediately walked over to Iriel and pushed her back, pointing her fan at the stranger, asking who he was, and asking him to get away from her right now, because she would regret it. Estelle looked at the stranger carefully, not understanding what was wrong with him, for he looked very dangerous. When the girl said in a confident voice that, if he didn't want to experience the power of the spirits, he'd better not play tricks and admit right now who he was, as well as what he was around Iriel for. But then suddenly the girl stopped her, telling her to stop doing that, for he had helped her. Estelle, hearing this, immediately softened and asked what she meant. Iriel turned to the man and apologized for the misunderstanding. Then she turned to Estelle and asked her to remove the perfume and apologize as well. Estelle obeyed the girl, and bowing she apologized, saying that she was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Balaam's. Her voice became much softer, and turning to the stranger, she asked what family he was even from. But Iriel didn't really like that, so she told the girl to stop asking all those questions. Rav suddenly laughed, but introduced himself anyway, saying that he was unfortunately a commoner, so he wouldn't be able to answer what family he was from. Estelle continued to cling to the girl and said that it was very suspicious that someone like him was even at this event. She also noticed that he had a sword present and wondered if he was really a commoner and not a knight. Iriel turned her attention to the man's belt and noticed that he did indeed have a sword. It looked very familiar, and she knew she had seen it somewhere before. But looking at all these patterns, she could not understand where she could see him. Estelle became very serious and said that he must be hiding something, and it was not good. Iriel turned her attention back to the girl, asking her to stop saying such nonsense. But the boy didn't react in any way, but just stood there smiling. He watched their argument and thought about the fact that after all, the girl had even made a wonderful friend, and that was just fine in his opinion. He was silent for a while, and then he turned to the girl, saying that it was all right, and since she was already safe, he would turn away and go about his business. And so he did. But Iriel did her best to stop him and asked him to wait a moment. The man didn't turn around, just walked closer to the exit. The girl stood watching, and couldn't believe that it was going to end like this. Estelle took her friend and started to lead her away, so that they could go to the event together. Iriel thought about the fact that they were finally almost getting to know each other now, but then suddenly, she had a strange feeling. She couldn't understand what was happening, as if she could feel the emotions of a completely different person in her body. The man himself continued to walk away and smiled as he thought about the fact that they would meet again after all. So he would not say goodbye to them until the end. Some time passed from then on, and Iriel finally came out. She met her brother, who was a little worried and said she was late. The girl didn't answer anything. Then he suddenly became worried and asked if she was all right. Iriel just stood there with red cheeks and didn't answer. Ed turned to Estelle and asked what was wrong with her, and wondered if she had gotten sick. But she sighed heavily and said she didn't know, but she was leaving, so he could ask her about it. That was the end of her mission. Her brother didn't understand what was going on with his sister, because she looked like she had eaten an incredible amount of cake. So he was even more curious about what had happened to her. They continued in silence for some time, and then Iriel, taking off her hat, told her brother that she thought she liked someone. Ed, hearing this, couldn't believe his eyes and questioned if she really liked someone already. Ariel smiled and said that was right. His name was Rav, and he was the most handsome guy she had ever met. She told me that he had dark hair and violet eyes. They were so wonderful you could just drown in them. Ed, hearing this, was immediately angry. He couldn't believe that the boy had dared to do that at all, and he didn't know who he was. He also assumed that his sister must have met him when he stepped away for a while. But he said that she was with Estelle after all, and the girl should at least do something in such a case. But at that moment Ariel went to the wagon, saying that jealousy was a very terrible quality, so she advised him to end it. But then suddenly the girl realized that her brother might tell anyone. So she stopped, turned to him, and told him that it was a secret. So she asked that he not tell anyone about it. Ariel also replied that he was a commoner, but status wasn't the most important thing, so she didn't think it was a big deal. She also asked her brother what he thought about it, but without waiting for an answer, she simply turned around and hummed some tune and walked on. The girl was incredibly happy to have met this stranger. Shortly afterward, when they returned to the estate, Ed came straight to his father and told him that apparently he had made an appearance after all. The boy replied that given Estelle's reaction, there was not a single doubt. His father immediately frowned and said, "Okay, in that case, the time has come after all." When she got home, Ariel went straight to town to buy herself a lot of new clothes. She needed something to occupy her days. And father in turn said that he would slowly prepare for what they had thought out, and also said that they needed to stop the holy awakening and by no means let it happen. The girl has now become very much followed by a lot of people, and the father also said that they need a lot more blood, so he starts their plan. Ariel, after picking out a few outfits for herself, stopped near a small shop with various jewelry. She just stood looking at it for a while, and the butler who had accompanied her apologized and said it had been 30 minutes, and wondered what she could take so long to choose. Ariel immediately looked at him, and in her hands she held a green-colored brooch, and asked what he thought of it, but the man was skeptical of her choice, and said it was a hackle. The butler explained that it was a cackhole, a piece of jewelry not for clothes, but for a sword. He had also heard that girls often gave such jewelry to boys. A saleswoman suddenly came up to them and said that he had a straight diamond eye and told the girl that this emerald-colored stone symbolizes happiness. Ariel wondered if it was true. The saleswoman smiled and said that emerald symbolized happiness and peridot symbolized friendship, and she explained that this is the kind of stone that is given to family members. The girl was surprised, began to look at this brooch and pondered the meaning of this stone. She was silent for a while, then said she would take it. The sales clerk was very happy about this choice and thanked her for it. They went on, and the girl turned to the butler and asked if there was anything for Daddy and Ed. Since they were already here, the butler was a little surprised to hear this, for he thought it was for one of them, and wondered who it would be for, since it was not for them. While they were talking, someone suddenly approached the girl, and she said, "Climp, you know, absolutely no need for whom it was for." She was so engrossed in the conversation that she didn't even notice the hand behind her starting to reach for her. Klimt managed to react in time and grabbed the man's arm, asking what he was doing and wondering if he had any business with the young mistress. Ariel immediately turned around to see who the man was, but when she turned around, she saw that it was exactly the man she had met last night. It was Rav. The man started to come closer and closer to the mistress, and the butler told him to stay back. But as he got closer, even he had to draw his sword against this stranger. Ariel, seeing this, was very frightened. She stood behind her attendant and angrily asked what he was even doing. Well, the man waved his hand in her direction and asked her not to get too close. After all, this guy wasn't as easy as she thought. In fact, Klimt has already spent a great deal of time fencing. However, this is the first time he sees such a monster, so he doesn't even know what to do. The girl herself was very worried about Rev at that moment, because she realized that he was in danger, so she had to protect him in some way. The butler suddenly heard footsteps from the young mistress and immediately turned to see where she was going. But at the same second, the girl jumped up and kicked him with both feet right on his knees. The boy barely managed to stay on his feet and looked at the young mistress in surprise, not understanding why she had done it at all. Ariel turned to her attendant and started yelling at him, saying that Rav was her friend and his rudeness was unforgivable. When the man heard that it was her friend, he was incredibly surprised. She then turned to her recent acquaintance and wondered if he had hurt himself. But the man smiled and replied that he was fine, so she needn't worry. Ariel also apologized, saying that he must have been very shocked by what had happened, and she also said that she apologized for her escort's behavior. She held the brooch she had recently bought behind her back and said she would like to make it up to her. The man, however, when he heard these words, hesitated, and after a while said that since the Annika wanted to thank him so much, he could do him a favor. When she heard this, she immediately glowed with joy and said that of course she would do anything for him. At that moment, Rav drew his fine sword and pointed it toward the aide, asking if she would give him the life of the brute. When Ariel heard this, she was very surprised. She shrieked in horror, for she had not expected him to ask such a thing. She began to stammer and tears came to the girl's eyes. She turned to Rav and told him that this guy was their butler, who was very dear to their family. That was her way of saying that she could give him anything he wanted, only she really asked that he not do what he had in mind. The girl was already in a state of tears, but she held it together for the moment. Rav, in turn, upon hearing those words, smiled and quickly put his sword back in its sheath, saying that he was just joking around so she might not worry. When she heard those words, she immediately exhaled a sigh of relief and said that she was very glad that it was really just a joke. Ariel was about to move closer, but suddenly she stumbled and began to fall. The man managed to react in time and picked her up. He also apologized for making a rude joke and said he wouldn't do it again. Rav then thought for a moment and said that he was actually asking her for a date as a thank you. Immediately afterward, they went somewhere in the woods where he led her. The girl had no chance to refuse. Ariel was very surprised, for she didn't even think he could ask for a date with her. They went downstairs, and the man helped her off the slide, telling her that they were almost there, and she should be careful. She thanked him, feeling very awkward, for she had never been alone with a man before. And even though she was very surprised at his behavior then when he made the joke, he's still as kind now as he was when they first met. They walked for some more time, and the man suddenly noticed that she was beginning to fall behind him, and looking at her narrow shoes, realized that she was probably uncomfortable. Rav walked closer to her and took her in his arms, telling her that she had apparently hurt her leg when she hit that night, so he would carry her the rest of the time to make sure her condition didn't worsen. Ariel felt incredibly uncomfortable. She was ready to fall to the ground over this whole situation, but she was glad that they had a little more to go, according to the man. Some time had indeed passed since then, and they stopped. Rav said that they had finally come to a place. The girl immediately looked to the side and saw an incredibly beautiful sunset, as well as a small piece of the lake that was visible from behind the trees. It was so beautiful that she couldn't even say a word, because she had never seen it before. The man set her down on a rock and told her to dip her feet in water. The cold would ease her pain. The girl did so at once, for she trusted him. He then asked if she liked it. Ariel immediately turned in his direction and smiled and said it was wonderful. They were silent for a while, and the girl turned away and said that she actually wanted to thank him all day, and if he didn't mind, she would like to know if he had any girls who had given him cackhole before. Rav was a little surprised at her question and was silent for a while. He also put his feet in the water and said that there had never really been any such thing. Then he got down on one knee and said that he really hoped he could get it from her, and inquired if she would let him do so. Ariel was very much embarrassed, and the man in turn drew his sword and asked if she wanted to attach the jewelry herself. The girl wasn't expecting it a bit, but when he placed the sword in her lap, she immediately said that she would love to do it. When she touched the weapon, she realized that it did look incredibly familiar to her. But Ariel couldn't figure out where she'd seen him before. For a while, she just stared at it. Then she said aloud that the sword was right at Beluk's side, held by the Holy Knight of Avalon. She carefully began to examine the engravings and said that even in the portraits he was the same, also white with a silver pattern. But she suddenly hesitated and said that Avalon was gone, and Beluku had been stolen. So surely this sword just looked like him and that was it. Then she apologized to him, saying that she was probably talking too much. The girl added that she just loved the story of the saint and Avalon. Rav smiled and said it's okay, because he really likes it too. He was glad to see her so happy, and it lifted his spirits. Ariel was a little embarrassed, but said that indeed she loved the story with all her heart, so she could get a little carried away with it sometimes. They were silent for a while longer, and then the man said that, as he had said, he was a commoner, and inquired if it would be all right, and would not affect them in any way. The girl replied that, of course, everything would be all right. His status didn't matter to her at all, and her feelings wouldn't change because of this little thing. Rav, hearing those words, smiled and stood to his feet and said that he was not at all satisfied with this. He didn't want her to be bullied because of his low status. He held out his hand to her and told her that if he could win at Ribbery, he would pledge his allegiance to her like a true knight. The man asked if she could wait for him. Ariel was already about to answer his hand in question, but then she suddenly realized that he must be referring to Emperor Riberi's gladiatorial tournaments. She remembered that her brother Ed would also be participating there, and he was a pretty strong knight. She was very doubtful that this decision would be a good one, for Rav could get very seriously hurt in this tournament, and she decided to wish him one condition after all in return for her waiting for him. The girl told him to stay out of the way, and if it was dangerous, he should refrain and stay out of the battle. The man, smiling, said that of course he would adhere to her condition and would definitely keep their promise. The girl also thought about the fact that she would gladly wait for him. When night came, the girl was already sleeping peacefully in her bed. Her father and brother were walking down the hall, and the man asked Ed if she was asleep. Toth, in turn, replied that she was very tired after her walk, so she went to bed quite early. The man opened the door to her room and said it was a great relief to them. They walked over to the bed where Ariel was sleeping peacefully and dreaming. For a while they were just silent, and then he smiled and said she was incredibly unconcerned about sleeping. After that, he pulled out a syringe and said, "Then I can't finish any sooner than expected, and that's fine." The man wiped a spot on her arm and began injecting her with some medicine and apologized to her, saying it was very necessary. Some more time passed from then on, and finally came the long-awaited Ribbery final and the tournament itself. All the citizens present, when they heard that the finals were about to begin, were incredibly excited about it. Then her host pointed toward the Rav and said that the strong guy who flew into this place like a comet would participate in the finals, and his opponent will be Edmund Heim, a brilliant swordsman from the Marquis family. So the host asked the people who would come out the winner in this tough contest. Most of the guests were of course rooting for Ido, as he was already their favorite and always won. Ariel, who was sitting in the most beautiful seat and watching it all, didn't even know who she should cheer for, because on the one hand her brother was fighting there, and on the other hand, she would really like Rav to win. Sometime before the finale came, the girl sat in her room and chose an outfit for a very long time. Ed inquired, "Maybe she'll put some clothes on already since she's been picking out clothes for an hour." Ariel put on one of the dresses and asked him if he liked it. The boy, when he saw her, said she looked incredible. The girl immediately got excited when she heard this, and said that in that case, she would wear it. The man, who was watching her twirling around the mirror, thought that it had been a long time ago, and could not believe that it had been much better then. They were silent for a while, and then he turned to his little sister and said that if she really loved him, he wouldn't bother them. Ariel immediately walked over to her brother and took his hands, and thanked him from the bottom of her heart for the opportunity. She said that he was the only one who was on her side, and she appreciated it very much. After that, they went straight to the duel. It was still a long way to the finals. Some warriors had to go through a few more rounds to make it to the end. Ariel couldn't keep still. She was looking for Rav and couldn't figure out where he was. Her friend, who was sitting next to her, looked at her indignantly, asking who she was looking for, but she didn't answer. Finally, when she could find the man with her gaze, she immediately shouted his name and waved back. The man, hearing someone calling him, pulled the hood off his head and smiled at her in greeting. Ariel sat back in his seat and almost fainted at his incredible beauty. He thought about the guy looking absolutely ravishing on this day. In fact, Ravnar is a regular knight who fights with a one-handed sword since the beginning of Ribbery, and the hosts who entered the tournament didn't know what he could surprise them with this time. Soon the fight finally began, and the boy began to confront his first opponent. He was the first to draw his sword, which began to glow brightly. All the guests present, when they saw this, were incredibly surprised and couldn't believe that he possessed swordsmanship. Ravnar was ready for an attack from that man. The enemy himself paid no attention to how brightly his sword was glowing and ran straight at him. However, the man had a very good reaction and managed to knock the sword out of his opponent's hands and aimed his sword straight at his head. The man realized that it was better for him to give up, so he said that he did not want to fight him anymore. The spectators were very surprised by such a fight, because they did not expect that the man would be able to cope with a rather strong opponent so quickly. Ariel, when the fight was over, was also very surprised. She hadn't thought that he would actually be able to win. The girl also thought that the man was incredibly strong and had done very well. The boy, for his part, when he was done fighting, turned in her direction and waved. He then took the jewelry he had attached to her sword and kissed it. He thought it brought him good luck. The girl blushed when she saw it. She didn't expect him to really like it and hang it on his beautiful sword. And so after each fight, the man kept waving to the girl, and she smiled happily and waved back. The men who were sitting nearby were watching all this, and one of them became very indignant and wondered if it wasn't Ariel of the Heims. Then he turned to the Marquis himself and said that his daughter had declined his offer of marriage, and wondered what he was thinking in giving her away to a commoner like the fellow below. The man shrugged and said that it was certainly his mistake, but what kind of normal parents would go against their child's will? She's still young and doesn't know much. However, they love each other, so he is definitely not an obstacle for them. Still, he didn't understand why the man called him a commoner, and also wondered if he didn't know that his status would change tomorrow. The boy, when he heard these words, became very angry. He got to his feet and said that the man was hiding the fact that he was a sword master and wondered if this was not a crime on the battlefield. Then a voice came from behind him. It was an elderly man, and he turned to Alphonse, telling him to stop shouting all over the arena. The man also said that he did not want to watch this spectacle on such a beautiful day. The two brothers sighed heavily, for their father had admonished them, but still they heard his request and were silent at last. The man himself at this moment thought about the fact that Ravnar had indeed turned out to be a master swordsman, and this was very interesting to him, for he had never known about it before. When the fight was over, the man went backstage so that the others could compete as well. When the fight was over, the man went backstage so that the others could also compete. He looked at Ed in surprise and wondered what he was even talking about, for he really didn't understand. Then the guy said he didn't understand why he was pretending as if he didn't understand anything. He used a sword, even though it wasn't even required. Ed also said that he didn't think it was wise at all, and suggested that maybe now his sister was even in danger from walking with him. For some time they were silent, and then the boy also asked, wondering if something dangerous was going to happen to his sister. Rav was silent for a while. Then, smiling, he suddenly stroked his head. The boy was very surprised at this gesture, but he immediately began to remove his hand, for it was very unpleasant for him, and asked him to stop. Well, the man said he didn't think anything could happen, but it's still best to be prepared. But he could still be wrong too. Rav also said that he doesn't know if the event from 4 years ago will happen again, but he still shouldn't worry because it will be completely different this time around. And then finally the finale came. The two men stood before each other and were excited for the battle, or Ariel was praying that the deal she and her brother had made would work out after all. And soon the finals began. The men fought very hard and could calmly repel each other's blows. Rav looked closely at his opponent's eyes and noticed that they were the same color as Ariel's. But at that moment he suddenly realized that he was distracting him on purpose, so he moved his sword away so that he wouldn't knock it out of his hands. In turn, he smiled happily and pointed his weapon towards his opponent, asking if he wasn't going to hold back. However, he jumped up and said that it would be over by now, so he might not worry too much. Well, a second later, he stumbled a bit. The sword flew in a completely different direction, and he fell to the ground. Rav immediately seized the opportunity and pointed his sword at his opponent. Then the fanfare played, and the referee announced that he had won this fight and the tournament after all. The girl, when she saw it, was very surprised, but at the same time also glad that no one was badly injured, and everyone is alive and well. Shortly after this duel, Ravnar was summoned to him by the Emperor and asked that he salute him and tell him what he wanted in general. In fact, 320 years ago, a guy also made a wish in this place because he felt sorry for her and wanted to stand up for the girl. Last time Rav kneeled down and asked that he could leave Ribery Castle and refuse to become the successor. But this time he was going to do things completely differently. The man also sat on his knee and said that he would like to enter Ribery's castle and become the successor. All because he doesn't want to make a completely stupid election again, like he did then, that cost him a lot of money. When people heard this, they immediately began to whisper. They did not expect him to actually ask for it. In fact, Ribery was the founder of an empire, and 500 years ago, this family has spawned many brilliant magicians and ministers. It was also the birthplace of the greatest number of saints in the empire. After Avalon's death, the imperial family took over her name. But if a successor emerges, they will be obliged to return the family to him. He already owns thousands of books on magic, but he wants the records and relics that are connected to the saints. Othello suddenly jumped up from his seat and asked that the fellow know his place. He turned to His Highness and said that if he complied with his request, the whole kingdom would have to fall at once, for it was incomprehensible how a commoner could become a duke himself in just one day. However, the emperor started yelling at him, telling him to shut up. You see, he has the right to fulfill any wish of Ribery's winner, and he doesn't understand how the guy even dares to challenge him. Then the emperor sat back in his seat and thought about the fact that mana had now ceased to exist. So magic books and artifacts had become completely useless. The man also thinks that this is perfectly acceptable, and if he uses this guy, he will become the emperor who fulfilled the biggest wish in this world. The swordmaster who appeared after a whole 5 years will come to power. In the end, after much discussion and hard decisions, his skills and abilities still recognized Rav's wish. It was fulfilled, and he became Ribery's heir. And Ariel, when she heard about all this, she immediately jumped up from her seat and ran to him. She began to hug the man tightly with all the joy she could muster. Rav was very surprised at this behavior of hers, and for a while he just stood there, but after that he hugged her back. Then the girl looked up and reached up to kiss him. After she kissed him on the lips, the man was very surprised, but happy at the same time. He stood stunned for a while. Then he turned to her, telling her that he had loved her from the first time they met, and he wished she would let him be with her after all. Ariel, when she heard about all this, was very surprised and blushed at the same time. But at that very moment, she also remembered the proposal that the other man had made to her. She realized that this was completely different from what was happening now. And now, when Rav confessed his love to her, she immediately remembered this scene. But in response, the girl said that she had always loved him too, and very much. Besides, she didn't pay much attention to this vision. Suddenly there was shouting from the side. It was Ed, addressing his sister, and behind him ran her father and mother. When they ran closer, the mother immediately hugged her daughter and said that she had really surprised her parents by doing such an act. But then suddenly her father became angry, and pointing toward the man, said that if she thought he would allow it after a public confession, she was deeply mistaken in her judgment. But then suddenly Rav smiled and told him to call him whatever he wanted, maybe even son-in-law. Then the girl's brother got angry, asking how he could call him that. After all, they are not even engaged to his sister. The man thought about it for a moment. Then he turned back to Ariel and asked her if she wanted to get engaged. The girl got a little embarrassed and asked if it really had to be done right now. If he wanted to make it all the more beautiful, they could go on another date. They were silent for a while. His father turned to Rav and asked if he had found a place to stay, for he knew he had been taken in by an imperial family. The boy thought for a moment, and then he said that if the test allowed it, he could, in principle, stay at High Manor, if he didn't object to it. Well, first he would inform His Majesty if things worked out. When his father heard this, he was furious and was ready to shout, but he changed his mind. But the man, seeing the happy face of his daughter, still could not refuse her and agreed to this favor. When evening came and the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, they finally returned to the manor. Rav got out first and helped Iriel down from the carriage. He wanted to help Ed too, but he pulled his hand away and said he thought his little sister would be alone forever. But apparently things didn't go according to his plan. Rav just smiled and ran his hand through the boy's hair. He was very angry and asked him to stop doing that because it annoyed him. The man in turn smiled and said that he just wanted to do it so badly. Then Ed went ahead, saying that he wanted to get to the manor as soon as possible, for he was hungry for the trip. After a while, everyone was already at the manor. They had changed into fresh clothes after the journey. In the meantime, the maids had set the table for them. Iriel sat down next to her lover and still couldn't believe that she would now be living and dining even with him. She felt as if she were in some kind of dream. After a while, the father spoke. He said to his wife that if they were taken to continue living in this place, his daughter would starve to death. Iriel looked in his direction all the time and ate almost nothing. He kept watching them closely the whole time. But his wife told him to mind his own business, so he kept quiet. Rav himself noticed that the girl was acting strangely, so he cut up his own piece of meat and held out a plate to her, saying that if she had no appetite, maybe she would try eating like this. Iriel still didn't take her eyes off him, but, repeating after the man, took a piece of meat and ate it. As she watched his kin chew on a piece of meat, she remembered this awkward moment when she almost managed to kiss him. She was a little embarrassed, but thought about how if she were a little taller, it might have worked out. Ed spoke then, turning to his sister and asking if she was tired. Maybe she would go to bed a little early, for it had been a long and busy day. Iriel, when she heard this, was a little surprised. After all, her brother had never said that before. But then suddenly, her father agreed with him and said that she had been watching the fight all day. So he turned to the maid Anna and asked her to take her. Iriel resented it, but she had to obey after all. She wasn't really tired at all and wanted to sit a little longer, but she couldn't go against her father's wishes. She waved goodbye to her lover, wishing him good night, and in turn, Rav told her to get a good night's rest. When the girl returned to her room, she began to make a beautiful wreath from the fresh flowers she had standing there. She had already changed into her pajamas and imagined wearing the wreath in the garden. She would congratulate him on his victory, and then when the atmosphere was right, they would kiss properly. As soon as she began to imagine it, she felt goosebumps running through her body and butterflies fluttering in her stomach. She couldn't even think of anything else but this. Iriel lay back on her bed and hugged her pillow, thinking about packing some food with her for breakfast the next day, so that if they got hungry, they could have a mini picnic. When it was late at night and the girl had finally gone to bed, her father was the first to enter the room. When she was asleep, he told the others that they could go in, as she would not hear anything. Then her brother came into the room at once, and Rav, passing by her bed, noticed a wreath of flowers lying on the floor. He picked it up and stared at it for a while. The father, who had been watching him for a while, just watched. After that, he sighed heavily and started to uncover his daughter, saying that she was good for going to sleep so early. When everything was ready, he turned to the man and, waving his head, signaled to him that he could approach. Rav slowly walked over to the girl's bed, then began directing all of his energy straight to her head. Nothing happened for a while, and then her hair suddenly began to shine very brightly. It was a beautiful sight, but the girl slept as if nothing had happened, and felt nothing. The man then took out a small case from which he also took out a small needle. He pierced the skin around his wrist and blood came out. Father and Ed looked at him intently. Then the man waved his head and started pulling a blade from his pocket. Then he suddenly turned to his father and asked if he could let him do it today. But the man smiled and said that she was too young, and it was his duty as a real father. And he in turn must protect his mother and sister when he is not around. So the man took the blade and slashed his arm above the carpet. A lot of blood came out, and it all ran straight to the floor. But in that second, the blood suddenly started to rise and the carpet became very clean. Iriel continued to lie on the bed and did nothing, but the blood began to circle right around her body. Ed, watching all this, thought about the fact that the pain was probably still the same, and it was, as always, incredibly unbearable. It was hard for him to even look at it, the blood pumping into her veins. The boy couldn't understand why all this was happening. He thought that if the blood was holy or something else, then she really wanted it all to go away. He didn't know why it was happening to his sister, and he felt sorry for her. He thought about the fact that, of course, no one would want to have such a powerful force. So he really hoped that his little sister would never remember anything and could live a peaceful life. 4 years before the events that were taking place, Iriel's father was riding in a carriage and he was very tired. The type of task he was doing was very difficult, and he was riding even all over the canyon. But he ended up bringing His Highness a monster named Nukta, which was caught by him in Pokaria Gorge. The emperor stared at the box for a while and pondered what to say to the man. However, Potaman merely turned around and waved his hand and said that he would take a look at it later. After that, he asked him to lock it up somewhere for the time being, because he couldn't keep this beast in the imperial palace. When the man heard this, he was very angry, for he did not understand why he had to bring him in at all, but he had no choice. He sat back in the wagon, not knowing what to do, but he would have to hide this huge animal in his home, because that was the emperor's order. But soon, when he returned to the manor, Iriel, who was still very young, ran to meet him to greet him. He immediately hugged his daughter and asked how she was doing. All this time, he was incredibly happy that he had finally returned, because seeing his father had really been gone for a very long time. Everyone else also came out to greet him. Ed, who was standing nearby, suddenly noticed that there was some huge black object standing beside the carriage in which his father had arrived, which interested him very much. The boy immediately inquired where he had gotten this strange thing. The man was a little worried, but then replied that it was just a reward from His Highness for his productive expedition. But then he hugged Ed and said that it didn't matter at all, because his son had grown a lot since their last meeting. The boy was not very pleased with the hug, but he was still wondering why the box was so big, because the reward couldn't be that big. When his father continued to give him a long hug, he pulled away from him and asked him to stop doing it already. He said he was no longer a child, for he was already 13 years old, and he had not even taken him with him on this interesting expedition, and he would like to see Nukta too, by the way. Dad was starting to get worried. He didn't understand why Ed was being so aggressive in the first place. He wanted to calm him down, but the boy said he didn't want to hear anything. Then, Iriel stood up for his father and said that his father had told him that even if he outgrew him, he would still win. So he could not take him on such a dangerous expedition. Her father smiled and said she was a good girl. Then he asked Ed if he understood everything, or if he needed to repeat it, because his sister had memorized it so well. His father smiled and told him to let the boy grow up a little more, and then we could think about some joint expeditions. After that, he took his training sword and went to the backyard. He was very upset, for he actually wanted to eat and also to go along with his daddy. He's old enough now and can handle any danger. The boy also thought about the fact that he could become the second swordmaster of the Heim family, one of the 4 in the empire. He would be the prodigy of our country, the genius of the century, the youngest swordmaster. And Nukta won't be anywhere near him. He had been practicing for a while longer when suddenly he heard someone talking from behind the bushes. It was a man's voice that said he was frightened of him, and asked his partner if he thought the creature might get out. Ed was very interested in this, and immediately looked out from behind the bushes. Then he saw 2 guards talking about it. His friend said that it couldn't be. They've locked him in there, so it's a creature in solid metal handcuffs. But just the thought of it is downright terrifying after returning from the gorge. One of them said that no one would notice if they left, so they decided to move away from the door for a while, to take a break and do their business. Ed, when he saw the open path, rejoiced and thought there was Nukta in that gift. But just as he was about to get closer, he heard a woman's voice. It was his sister, and she asked what he was doing there. When he looked at her, he exhaled in relief and said that she had really scared him. But Iriel still wondered what he was looking at. She immediately looked out after the boy. Ed thought at that moment that if he showed her something funny, she might like it. So he offered to show her something funny he'd recently found. Iriel was immediately interested when she heard about something fun, for she was very fond of various adventures. They headed straight for those doors. As they started down the dark corridors, the girl asked what the smell was. She also said that her father had forbidden them to go to this place. But the boy waved his hand and said he would protect her, so she didn't have to worry. When they were at the very bottom, the guy flicked a match and lit a small candle so they could see something. They approached one of the cages, from which came various strange sounds they could not make out. Ariel was a little startled and wondered what those sounds were, for she couldn't make them out at all. Then she suggested that her brother just leave. But at that moment, they suddenly saw two luminous eyes, and the children screamed loudly, for these eyes began to come toward them and beat directly against the cage. The girl even fell to the ground in surprise. She hid behind her brother's back and wondered what they should do. After all, it might get out. But Ed stood there with full confidence in his eyes and said it was all right. The monster was on the big castle, so it couldn't get out. At that moment, huge black fingers with very long claws emerged from the bars. They began to scrape the metal, and the sound was very unpleasant. Ed was already scared. He hugged his sister and realized that it was trying its best to get out. They heard loud growls, sobs, and many more different sounds that are impossible to describe. And after some time, the animal was able to open this cage and showed its huge teeth, which opened from its mouth. It moved slowly at first, and then jumped right out at the children, beginning to growl and wave its clawed hands. So this monster got Ed and cut his whole back open, from where a lot of blood spurted out, and the guy was just in shock. After that, there was a loud scream from his sister, who was very frightened. So the boy could not stay on his feet any longer and began to fall to the ground. The blood was pouring out of his back and also out of his mouth because of the strong blow. This animal was not going to stop. It thrust its arm completely through the boy's body and lifted him up. Ed, who was still miraculously alive, began coughing and could barely breathe. He was already dying because the wound was fatal. Ariel stood watching in cold horror. Tears streamed down her eyes, and she didn't know what she should do, for she couldn't move a millimeter because of her panic and fear. At this point, the animal wasn't going to stop. It took a bite out of the guy's arm, trying to bite it off to eat. Then the girl couldn't take it anymore. She started screaming loudly and begging the monster to stop. But of course it did not understand her and was not going to listen. Ed, who was still miraculously conscious, realized that this animal was going to eat him, but he couldn't help himself. His strength was failing him. Then Ariel finally decided to act. She found a stick that was lying nearby and threw it directly at the creature's leg. Then she picked up the stick again and approached the creature. The monster continued to hold the boy and torture him, but at the same time it was distracted by her. But at that moment it only waved its tail, and Ariel fell back to the ground with a scream, feeling a severe pain in her leg. Seeing this, Ed immediately started screaming in its direction. He thought the monster might kill him, but it wouldn't touch her. At this moment, he took out his sword from the special sheath, and with his last strength, he pierced the eye of that monster, thinking that no one should hurt his sister. The boy's face was now covered not only with his own blood, but also with the blood of the monster. There was a loud roar as the creature felt great pain, but it continued to hold the boy, not letting go. For a while longer the animal resisted, but soon fell to the ground, throwing the boy aside. Ed was completely bloody, and when he did it on adrenaline, he dropped dead unconscious. Soon afterward, he was taken to bed and had all his wounds dressed. The doctor said that the poison of the nukta spread from the arm to the heart, and if this continued, he would not last more than a day. The doctor said they absolutely had to amputate the arm or the boy would not survive. When the father heard this, he was shocked. The father asked the doctor if there was no other, more humane way. He was ready to pay a lot of money and do anything to save his son. But the doctor sighed heavily, and looking at the father, said that if they didn't amputate the arm, the boy simply wouldn't survive. If the father wanted to make it less painful, he would have to do it himself. Then the father couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the doctor by the shirt and asked him if he was seriously asking him to cut off his son's arm himself and make him an invalid for life. Ariel, sitting next to her dying brother's bed, was very surprised to hear this. She was afraid that her beloved brother would be tormented by all this. The brother himself still had not regained consciousness. He was lying there in severe pain, twisting his head and even making occasional sounds of pain. Then the girl got to her feet and began to address her brother. asking him to open his eyes. She repeated this over and over again, and suddenly she saw that he did open his eyes. He burst into tears and apologized to everyone, saying it was his own fault. He couldn't stop crying and kept saying that it was all his fault, that he didn't want it to be like this. Ariel thought about the fact that an invalid with a piece of Backheim's air would be a stab in the back for his parents' reputation. But then his father stepped up to him and assured him that he would survive, and they would be sure to save him. Then Ariel cried and confessed that it was all her fault. But her mother hugged her and told her that it was no one's fault, and they were all just trying to do their best to save her.